So now for the final part of our program, I give you once again the founder of Potrero Hill History Night, Peter Linenthal.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. First off, we're running late, but that's a good thing, so we'll just be a little late. I'm excited because I want to introduce a friend of mine who I've known since high school. Mat Callahan and I went to Lake Wilmerding together. And at that time, he was already an amazing musician. But since that time, 50 years ago, he's also an author, songwriter, activist, music producer, engineer. And I just found out tonight that he recorded a CD in this building when it first opened. So that was pretty amazing. He also lived in the neighborhood in the 60s and 70s. And if you look at his website, matcallahan.com, you'll find books and music, more than I could mention there. But one book that is recent, I would like to mention. His book, The Explosion of Deferred Dreams, Musical Renaissance and Social Revolution in San Francisco, 1965 to 75, is a vivid portrayal of that time, particularly the intersection of music and politics. What I find particularly phenomenal about the book is that Matt lives in Switzerland at the moment, and was able to make this amazingly detailed history from there, with, of course, trips to the area. Also, his most recent CD and songbook, Working Class Heroes, pre-World War II folk songs, is, you gotta check it out. So, also, Matt started the funky political rock band, the Looters, which played at the Farm on Potrero Avenue, and was the first U.S. rock band to play in Nicaragua in 1983 after the revolution. So I would like to introduce my old friend, Mat Callahan. And Matt, this is a little thing for you from the Archive Project.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Great. I'll go up here.
Okay.
Can I?
Yeah.
Start with, can you hear this? Is this working? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to say a few things tonight that I won't say anywhere else, because it wouldn't really interest anybody else. But I came into this world 68 years ago at 18th in Pennsylvania. That's where Kaiser had a hospital, and that's where I was born. So I was literally born on Potrero Hill. And 50 years ago, my son was born on Potrero Hill. I was living at 806A Arkansas when Entelechy entered the world. He was actually born at French Hospital out on Geary Street, but we were living there at the time. So we'll get into a little bit of that, how those connections were made in a moment, but there are a lot of connections to Potrero Hill that I can use to get into actually some of the bigger questions that I wanted to talk about derived from this book about music and politics in the 60s. First of all, my family, I'm a red diaper baby. My parents were in the Communist Party and the ILWU, and were very active with people who were residents of the Hill, meaning I wasn't living on the Hill. In fact, I was born here, but I was at the time living in the Fillmore. That's where my parents lived, and then they moved out to West Portal, and so I was never actually living on the Hill until much later. But many of their friends and many of the people I grew up with, including some of my oldest friends, were actually residing on the Hill and were connected in very direct ways to historical events. For example, I went to school, and Peter went to school with him as well, with Tom Powell. And his parents were living at 24th and Rhode Island in a house that they had purchased, a dilapidated, rundown house that they had purchased to renovate, to live in, and to resell. Why? Because when they returned from China, John Powell was a journalist, main writer on what was the main English language journal in China prior to and shortly after the revolution. John and his wife Sylvia were arrested immediately upon arrival and charged with treason. The reason that they were arrested and charged with treason is that they had done research on the use of bacteriological warfare on the part of the United States during the Korean War. It was for this research and the fact that they were going to be blowing the whistle that the FBI met them at the airport or the dock, wherever they arrived. I think they arrived by boat, and whisked them away. Naturally, the Powells were able to get on bail and were embroiled immediately in a legal fight over these charges, and they could not get work as journalists and so on and so forth, which is why they ended up finding work renovating old houses and reselling them for a profit. Meanwhile, they were being defended by Doris Bryn Walker, who lived also on the Hill until she died in 2009 at the age of 100, I believe. And Doris Bryn Walker made her case in a very radical way at the time. There had been numerous cases brought by the U.S. government against communists in the post-war era, the McCarthy period, and they went, in this case, it was a special case, because it was not just somebody being called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, but actually being charged with treason, later changed to sedition. But in any case, Doris Walker led the militant resistance in the courtroom, taking a very aggressive stance against the charges, and were eventually, the charges were in fact eventually dropped. Doris Walker, as you may know, went on to other famous cases. She represented Angela Davis, and again taking the same aggressive militant line as opposed to a defensive posture against the state and the falseness of the charges, and eventually was able to prevail in that case as well. There were other connections, some of which actually go much further afield than Potrero Hill, and that's particularly the Ota family, who were connected directly to Pete Seeger, of course. Toshi was, I heard Alan Ota was mentioned earlier tonight, but this is also a personal connection with me, because when I came back to the Hill at the age of 17, and I'll get into how this occurred, through political activism, I encountered my generation of the Otas, starting with Michael, who's in the audience tonight. And I think that that's where things start to, in a certain sense, dovetail between the personal and the political or historical. And I think that part of it is simply being born here in San Francisco in the 60s, and what some of the events were that were unfolding around us. Part of it is related to the fact that the Vietnam War was raging and I was going to be drafted, and that was a major influence on young people throughout the United States. Part of it was the emergence of the Black Panther Party in Oakland in 1966. And all of these things kind of coming together in my life and in this particular location in an unusual, but nonetheless somehow representative manner. So I come up to Potrero Hill to meet somebody who later became my wife and the mother of my son. And I'd gone to Lick Wilmerding, as was mentioned, but I left and went to Poly to finish Polytechnic High School. And in Polytechnic High School, I had a number of friends who were Panthers, and it was just part of being young at that time. In other words, it didn't make me political or get active at all in and of itself. It just was part of the everyday life. However, my wife at the time found a a leaflet, a flyer on a muni bus that said, "Invite a Black Panther to your home." I mean, it sounds kind of crazy today, but we did it. And we assembled our family, and 2 Panthers came quite late, but they did come, probably because they hadn't been asked before and thought there was nobody on duty or whatever. I have no idea. But one of them happened to be one of the guys I went to high school with. So it was sort of like, wow, what's happening here? These are people I actually know. They know me. It's kind of cool. The whole family's there. Everybody wants to hear. And they gave a talk about free breakfast for children programs and how they were encouraging people in communities throughout the Bay Area to launch these free breakfast for children program. Okay, so we're living on the Hill, and 806A Arkansas, and we're saying, okay, well, I guess these are our orders, let's go start a free breakfast for children program. And we didn't really know how to do that. I was 18, and my partner was like 23, something like that, and we didn't really know much about making breakfast, let alone free breakfast for children program. But we thought, all right, well, we'll just go to the neighborhood house and ask somebody, and who was there but Nola Maxwell. And we started talking to Nola, who was a wonderful person, became a very close friend, and somebody with whom we worked for years. Great person, truly. And it's special that her name was on this school. It's rare that people who deserve it get honored. But anyway, she was very kind. I think she probably looked askance at these 2 white kids who wanted to start a Black Panther free breakfast for children program in Potrero Hill, but she did not discourage us. I remember that very vividly. And in fact, she encouraged us to let other people in the community know. We were not residents. I mean, we were residents of the Hill, but it's not like I knew all these people at the time. And so we put out a call, and 200 people or so showed up at the neighborhood house. It was just like, what? Completely astonished, totally unprepared. That's where I met Michael and a whole host of other political activists on the Hill at the time, including members of the San Francisco Mime Troupe and people who were at the origins of the starting point of the Bay Area Revolutionary Union. So there was a congregation of different political forces at this meeting, which led to a number of different things, not to a free breakfast for children program. That never actually happened. We could never get it together for a wide variety of reasons, which I will not go into. But the interesting thing is that the discussions and the kinds of political involvement that were concentrated in those early meetings were really what the 60s was all about. And so, for example, and this in a strange way ties into that movie we just saw, we learned a number of things about why there wasn't a free breakfast for children program on Potrero Hill. And it turned out that the Panthers had been unable to organize on the back of the hill. It may not be well known to at this time, but for many people, Potrero Hill was Heroin Hill. That was the nickname that it had actually earned in certain circles, and there were a lot of drug pushers dominating the projects back there, and they had made it really difficult for the Panthers to actually get any kind of foothold in the neighborhood. And interestingly enough, what did manage to gain some traction at that point, and something that we became involved with, my partner and I, was welfare rights. And the National Welfare Rights Organization was one of the most revolutionary organizations of the 60s. And so most of the time that I spent in those projects was at meetings with mainly women, as Maria Angela said, but essentially trying to organize what today would be considered, I think, a simply progressive demand, but was in fact as I say, one of the most revolutionary components of the 60s. And let me just read something briefly from this. Because all but forgotten in most counts of the 60s was the growth of the National Welfare Rights Organization, which pointedly linked poverty with the oppression of women. Welfare is a Women's Issue was the title of a widely read essay by NWRO leader Johnny Tillman. In it, she argued that the system depended first and foremost on the unpaid labor of housework and child rearing. It followed, therefore, that welfare should be viewed as a means of recompense, not a charitable donation to the poor. This was and remains one of the most revolutionary contributions of the 60s. The depth and breadth of its influence is indicated by the fact that the NWRO had at least 22,000 members, 90% of whom were black women, in a nationwide organization. While historical attention is most often focused on specific issues such as abortion, maternity leave, equal pay, gender quotas, and the battles waged to improve women's status within capitalism, the demand that women be compensated for hitherto unpaid yet vitally necessary labor challenged the very foundation of the system. Indeed, it is often overlooked that the general tenor of the women's movement in the 60s was consistently radical in two senses. First, equality was something the rigidly hierarchical system could never provide. Second, all the traits commonly defined as feminine, such as caring, sharing, nurturing, and healing, are practical tasks and moral virtues upon which society depends for its very existence. So that's what was happening in those projects. That's what was actually being organized. That's what we were attempting to address at that time. And what's important about that is not so much the success or failure. In the end, I think the Welfare Rights Organization soldiered on for a number of decades, but I'm not sure it even still exists. In any case, those demands have not been met. That is certain. And more to the point, the mood or the climate, the social ambience of the time was precisely that, meaning a revolutionary challenge to the status quo, an overt challenge to capitalism as a system, and not simply a demand for reforms or a demand for piecemeal changes. The fact that we failed to achieve that is partly responsible for the situation that prevails to this day on the back of that hill. So that's just a little connection there between one meeting and the involvement that I personally had. But this leads on to another dimension of this whole story, because at the same time and at the same meeting were people from the San Francisco Mime Troupe, who, the founder of which is in the audience tonight too, and is a Hill resident as well, Ron Davis. And in many ways, the connections that were forged, you could say, were inevitable in a sense. I mean, obviously chance plays a big role. If I hadn't moved at a certain time to 806A Arkansas, maybe it would have been different, and so on and so forth. But the times that brought forth a welfare rights organization or a Black Panther Party or a Bay Area Revolutionary Union or a theater group like the San Francisco Mime Troupe were revolutionary times. Now, what do I mean by that? Everybody knows that the word revolution has been used so much that it's actually, sort of devoid of any actual content. I recall seeing, this goes back a few years, maybe 2001, Time magazine having a picture of George Bush on the cover saying, American Revolutionary. I mean, if that's what that means, it goes beyond revolutionary soap suds. We're talking about a serious deformation of a word. In any case, in 1967, 1968, 1969, revolution definitely meant the overthrow of the capitalist system. That was certainly the implication that everybody I knew and most of the people I had any association with gave it when we used it. The fact that we were naive about how imminent it was is another question. That's, a question of analysis or lack thereof, but that was certainly the prevailing mood in my generation. I want to mention a little bit more about the mime troupe because I personally got involved. I never actually was a member of the mime troupe, but they had a building down on Alabama Street at the foot of the hill across from American Can at the time. And since some of them had come to this meeting and wanted to contribute to the establishment of a free breakfast for children program, we got to know each other. We started talking about music, and I ended up joining with a bunch of mime troupe members to form what was called Red Rock. And this was a band that, was a big band with horns, and it was an extravagant thing that went on for about 6 or 9 months. I can't remember how long. But again, it was very much a product of the times, and it certainly was an outgrowth of these various different efforts, whether it was Panther movement things, welfare rights organization, or radical street theater. And that I have to mention this radical street theater again for another reason. And this is, again, a bit, you might say, scattered. Hopefully I can pull it all together in some neat package at the end. But part of the reason I wrote this book, or was inspired to write the book, was that in 2007, the 40th anniversary of the Summer of Love was being trumpeted throughout the world. And I was in Switzerland at the time, 10,000 miles away, reading stories in German, Italian, French, English, all saying basically the same thing, that this great event had happened, promoting hippies, flower power, acid rock, and getting high in the park, at Golden Gate Park, that is. And not only did I know that that was a distortion of fact, to say the least, but the fact that it did not actually convey any of the actual things that people themselves used, the terminology that we used, or the actual artistic tools that we actually used, or the social tools that we actually used, or the significance of the endeavors of groups like the San Francisco Mime Troupe, who pioneering guerrilla theater and opening the public space in parks throughout the city, had actually opened a space for what you might say is festival in the classic sense of the word. Not the rock festival or the jazz festival, but festival, which was a very big part of what actually attracted attention to San Francisco in the first place, but was a very far cry from a non-existent event, the Summer of Love, and had very little to do, which itself had very little to do with what was actually taking place in San Francisco in 1967. And just a reference point to bring it back is that in doing the research for the book, I uncovered a peculiar movie, which I actually recalled from the time, although I'd never seen it. And this movie was called Revolution. And the reason I recalled it, in fact, the only reason I recalled it, was that Mother Earth, one of my favorite bands, had sung the theme song, Revolution. And so I was aware of that song, and I was aware of the fact that Mother Earth had done this film score or whatever, but I'd never seen the movie, and I just I didn't grasp any of its significance, but in doing the research, I felt it was important to actually dig it up. So I did, and now you can find these things online. You can find, they'll actually send you a copy for a few bucks, whatever, and I managed to get a hold of it. And in brief, the film made in 1967, at this very moment that is being celebrated as the Summer of Love year, 40 years after the fact, all over the world, never mentions the word. Summer of Love is never mentioned not once in the whole film. What is shown, among other things, are a very diverse population, ethnically diverse, people celebrating in the parks, for sure, rock music, of course, pictures of, inside pictures of the Fillmore Auditorium or the Avalon Ballroom, of course, and you can kind of tell fairly quickly why the film failed, because it's not a very good film. But it is interesting insofar as it actually gives some accurate portrayals of what was actually happening on the streets. As a document of fact, it's much more interesting than as cinema. And in it is a wonderful statement by Ron Davis at the end, which he was kind enough to tell me. I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Ron, but I think they gave you some money to say in 1 minute whatever you wanted to say. And so Ron gives a marvelous mile-a-minute rap that in a very short way sums up what was really happening at the time in terms of the revolutionary spirit, the revolutionary ideals that were being expressed through the mime troupe's own work, but also encompassed the feelings of a whole generation. So I want to conclude with a couple of things because, first of all, it's been a long night, we're overtime and so on. But secondly, I don't want to leave without saying a couple things about the future, because the other thing about history is that it not only tells you that things were not always the way they are now, but it also tells you that they will not always be the way they are now. And so I think a lot of people are let's say in agreement with how bleak the situation appears. And so I'm not going to go into a litany of woes. But I do want to quote a statement made by a philosopher by the name of Alain Badiou, who, reflecting on the defeat of the revolution of 1968, the worldwide revolution of 1968, the defeat of the revolutionary absurdity of that period, had this to say. He said, and he's specifically referring to the Reagan-Thatcher era that followed in 1980. The years that followed 1980 remind one of what Mallarmé, a great French poet, rightly said about those that came after 1880. A present is lacking. Since counter-revolutionary periods resemble one another far more than revolutionary ones, we should not be surprised that after the leftism of the 60s, we now revisit the reactive ideas that emerged in the wake of the Paris Commune. This is because the interval between an event of emancipation and another leaves us fallaciously enthralled to the idea that nothing begins or will ever begin, even if we find ourselves caught in the midst of an infernal and immobile agitation. And I can't think of a better representation of an infinite and immobile agitation than Silicon Valley, and what all that represents, and all of that not only symbolizes, but actually puts into motion. And the reason I make that comment in this regard is because people forget what the subtitle of the making of a counterculture was. Many people here are too young to know that word was coined by Theodore Roszak in 1968. A book was published in 1969 called The Making of a Counterculture, and the word counterculture now has been co-opted and used for all sorts of things. But the subtitle was The Technocratic Society and Its Youthful Opposition. And we shouldn't forget that the Steve Jobs and those characters co-opted that spirit or whatever to turn it into the technocratic society. That is precisely what they did. They deliberately did it, they consciously did it in order to create this dynamic that we're faced with today. And it's very important in that regard, coming back to what Peter said at the beginning, that we understand what history actually has to tell us, that we preserve it not only in the form of our sharing it with each other, although that's very important, but also in these archival means so that it's available to future generations so that people can actually access what people who did the research and actually tell the story with evidence, physical facts, and so on and so forth have to say. This is extremely important. Otherwise, we're essentially surrendering our memory to them. And that's how I'd like to conclude at the moment. Thank you.